Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us for this Plato Q&As. One quick word about Plato. It is the mentorship platform for engineering leaders. My name is Anna. I'm CTO at Enelect, and today with me we have Shanique Nandy, President and Chief Development Officer at Okta. Shanique, could you tell us a little bit more about you and your past experiences?
Hi, Anna. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. I have been in Okta for a year and a half. I was, till 3 months back, their CTO. In the last 3 months, I've also started overseeing the product and design aspects of their core workforce identity offering. So so I think we're calling that Chief Dev Officer. Prior to that, I spent 15 years in Google doing all sorts of things around data analytics, advertising. So overall, if I have to summarize my journey so far, it's been a lot of building products from scratch till hopefully lots of successful offerings, and then very high throughput but critical infrastructure systems. Like those have been the two patterns, like products from zero to heavy growth and success, and then lots of critical infrastructure, which lots of things depend on. But still learning, still making mistakes in tons on a regular basis, which is why these conversations are always helpful to learn from each other. So very excited to be here. Thank you.
So let's kick things off. It sounds like you will be able to share with us a lot of war stories. Doing more with less, that's a very timely topic. The tech industry is going through a lot of layoffs and has been going through for months now. So everybody needs to remain competitive, doing more with fewer resources. Can you share with us, first of all, how do you interpret the word engineering efficiency, like what it means for you, and how do you approach measuring it?
Yeah, so when I look at efficiency, there are 4 kinds of efficiency, at least like we are trying to rationalize it that way. There's engineering efficiency, there is people efficiency, there's process efficiency, and then there's structural efficiency. Engineering efficiency, resource efficiency, not people being one kind of resource, process efficiency and structural efficiency. And for engineering efficiency, I think I've mentioned this in the previous Plato event. One of my early mentors told me this thing that as engineers, we are really good at debugging systems and optimizing systems. You see a system, as engineers, we are very good at instantly saying, how can I get this exact same thing done with 10% less resources, or how can I support 20% more throughput? We typically don't do that with engineers. Like we don't look at a pool of engineers and say, like, are they functioning optimally? Like, can they be 10% more efficient? Because sometimes it's not even clear what 10% more efficient means. Can we increase throughput? Can they scale better? So if you just shift that engineering mindset to teams and people, like that's how I've often looked at it. Look at any team, define what success, efficiency is, and then set some kind of quantification. It'll almost definitely be inaccurate, but as long as it's directionally right, I think it's good. And then try to improve it, try to move it in the right way.
I like that you started immediately with team efficiency, and I guess people coming together to work together. Lots of engineering books talk about jelly teams or put a successful team. So do you have any tips on how to create those efficient teams, those magical teams when people come together and just start building fast?
Yeah, so when I was in Google, they actually did a very extensive research on what are successful, what makes teams successful, efficient, and there are all sorts of things starting from psychological safety, the sense of belonging. There's a whole bunch. There's a pyramid that's there. So there clearly the people trust that side of it. For this conversation, if I focus on engineering throughput of work, one thing I've learned is there's no one way of measuring it. But what is very evident, if you ask 20 engineers, like, what's the best way to measure efficiency, you'll get 25 different answers. However, what you'll probably get very consistently if you ask them that, are we improving or are we regressing? you'll see directionally people will agree fairly emphatically. So I've always focused on that. So one of the things I've done in a lot of our previous teams is get that very simple, because people have survey, they get tired of surveys. A single one question survey every 3 months. That when you compare with 3 months back, have things gotten better or worse in terms of what you think is your personal productivity? And I've been surprised at the aggregate of that, how good that is. Like, now, in all fairness, we had two questions. If they said it's gotten worse, we would ask them which part of the code base or pocket they work on. We would also send this question sometimes to cross-functional teams. So it's important to get your product team's perspective. Sometimes the engineering team might think they are doing a stellar job, but you'll see like your product partners might feel like things have gotten slower, or your go-to-market partners might feel that way. But over the years, I've found this metric, and I've spoken to many of my friends, some of whom have adopted this, to be directionally very accurate. It instantly gives you a feeling of like, are people feeling like productivity is going up or down? Now, beyond that, you can also choose. So we used to use this overall metric, that if X% people feel things are improving, what is X 3 months from now? But beyond that, there are things like mean time to deploy. The next one I'll say like is very polarizing. Getting any kind of like code throughput metrics, and then instantly you'll have all sorts of like pushback saying, well, like what if it's big changes as opposed to many small ones? So yes, like metrics will always be flawed, but assuming team composition is roughly same, just seeing what the metrics are over time can be helpful.
Makes sense. I like that you started picking up on specific metrics. So can you talk a bit more, because you have such a wide experience at really large companies and really small companies. Can you talk about what engineering efficiency means for if you're a small startup of 5 and if you're a large corporation of 300 plus people?
Yeah. So efficiency, quality, these are two things that constantly change. And also, I feel they have some form of a cyclic pattern they assume. Like, it's a common pattern where teams are seen as very, very efficient. And at some point, you get pushback that, hey, quality might be taking a hit. So you turn up the lever for quality, and productivity might seem like it's going down. And at some point, people are like, well, it's just too hard to get anything out. And then you again like probably revisit some things and product. So there are these cycles, but typically for smaller teams, and again, there's no fixed rule, but in the early days of both teams and products, feature throughput and hitting timeline milestones are often a very good indication of RU, because at that point you're in this, like, you have to get it out. Like, you're not thinking as much about like scale. You're not thinking as much about like, is it completely polished? So at that point, it's throughput is your key focus, and code is obviously a good internal metric. There's this notion of internal metric, input and output metrics. Output metrics is what you judge overall success by. Input metrics are metrics that feed into those output metrics. So output metrics would be features. Output metrics would be hitting timelines. Like how often do you hit those? Now, input metrics leading to those could be all sorts of things like code throughput, number of developers, all sorts of things, mean time to deploy, your release cycle, etc., all sorts of things. But the end user doesn't care about those. And that's for small teams. And then as teams grow, as products grow, I think quality metrics come in. Like, that's when number of bugs, CSAT, some kind of indication of, are you thrilling your end users? Are you just like shipping things, or are they landing? Operational metrics, those come into effect. So it ends up being more of a mix of those.
That's makes sense. Shanik, yesterday when we were talking, you also mentioned something that I really liked. You talked about costs of running a system. So can you talk, because I started by asking you about engineering efficiency, but as you rightly pointed out in the beginning of our conversations, there is also processes efficiencies and system efficiency. So can you talk about the cost of running a system and the processes efficiency side of efficiency?
Yeah. So the as I mentioned, engineering efficiency, resource, so cost often falls in that resource bucket, and then there's process and structural. So for resource efficiency, again, in the early days of development, you're just building things. You're not looking at like, is my data warehouse optimized? Is my database access optimized? Because at that point, like getting things out is important. Cost is not really as much of a factor. Obviously, it's always a factor, but not so much. As things stabilize, as scaling starts happen, it's just a reality. At some point, someone will come knocking on your door and saying, "Can you make this more efficient?" And we were discussing yesterday that I've seen this and over the years, and I've spoken to so many other engineering leaders who end up spending a lot of time with their finance counterparts who at some point is like, hey, your COGS has to be a certain percentage, or hey, our overall profitability, like resources becoming like whether it's people resource, whether it's so for everyone here, keep in mind that sooner or later you'll face the thing that whatever you're doing, people will expect you to do it more efficiently. So an approach I've used over the years as a good thought exercise is whatever you're doing, both in terms of building the system, deploying the system, and maintaining the system, these three, uh, assume that 2 years down the line, people will expect double of that to happen with half the cost. Now, it's not exactly that, but if you think in terms of those numbers, I think instead of trying incremental shifts, you'll think of bigger shifts. So imagine it costs you $1 million to serve a QPS. You should expect that 2 years down the line, people will expect you to serve twice of A with $500,000 because there'll be natural expectation that your cloud deployment will get better. Your systems will get optimized. Cost of resources will go down because you'll have like uh, improvements made outside, like your overall infrastructure improvements will happen. A lot of automation and tooling will come in. So if you, again, that's not a hard rule, but going with that approach of like 2x with half the resources, doing that thought exercise will really make you think about like what are some fundamental things we can do differently. Like, and I've seen over the years like very very different, like people have completely rewritten their stack, they revisited particular infrastructure, they have played around with their deployment model, how much redundancy they have, how hot or cold they run their systems. Typically utilization is very low in the early days because you're over provisioned. Once you hit a certain scale, you revisit, you'll get like this like push and pull where you're like, okay, you're running at like, let's say 30% utilization, counting for a certain amount of occasional peaks, and people will be like, hey, like, can I increase that 30? And then you're like, well, you pay for the peak sometimes, so you start doing all sorts of things, but keeping system cost in mind, keeping people cost in mind. On the people cost, at some point you'll need a reasonable. If you look at R&D as a percentage of cost, I know there was a Plato thread actually sometime back on this. Uh, if you look around, teams are getting globally deployed, so you have a certain cost mix of like how expensive is it to hire a particular person overall. Now you want a good mix, you have seniority. Again, in the early days sometimes teams end up being more senior. Over time you have mixes, all these things, but just expect that no matter what you're doing, same thing with operational. If it takes like your SRE team X people to support Y alerts, 2 years down the line, there will be more alerts because the system will get more complex. And you should have automation and tooling in place that you should be able to do it with half the people. So,
Yes, thanks for calling this out, Janik. It's fascinating. As systems grow, the consistent optimization and retooling is just a byproduct of an inevitable result of growing a system in the first place, and it's fascinating with its own difficulties. So let's flip then this around of what not to do. So what are in your opinion, what are the common mistakes that leads to reduced efficiency? What prevents engineering teams being their best?
uh, again, like there's no fixed set of answers, but common deterrents I've seen. One is spending a lot of time in discussion. As engineers, we love perfection, and perfection often gets in the path of very, very good. Now, there are things where perfection is needed, but the number of times I've seen people spend like 7, 10 meetings just discussing like what's the measure of productivity without then agreeing on anything versus just starting with something, tracking it, and then improving on it. Same thing with like your deployment model. Um, I've I was talking to someone where a certain system was running at, let's say, 30% utilization. And someone suggested, hey, we should run it at 50. And then there were countless discussions on like, well, is 50 too much? But later they realized like, had they just said 40, no one would have complained. And then the 40 to 50 conversation could have happened as a second one. But they were at 30, 50 seemed contentious. And they spent months debating that as opposed to saying, maybe we take it from 30 to 40 and then 40 to 50. So don't over invest. And sometimes as leaders, you have to make sure that where these conversations happen, the right composition of grouping is there. Because oftentimes a few senior people can dictate the conversation and miss out some, this is very true for engineering efficiency, the thing we discussed first. Oftentimes you judge whether a system is nimble, agile by bringing into the room the people who designed that system. So they are over invested towards the system. They also know the system better than others. So they're like, obviously this is easy. Like, what are you telling me that developing is hard? Whereas if you ask people who've just joined the team, new engineers, they'll be like, oh, it's horrific to get stuff done. So make sure you have the right people in the room. That's another thing that often happens is the conversations don't land where they should because the conversations are dictated by a few, not bad, but sometimes biased or maybe select folks who don't see the problem as much as the broader pool. The other is not making continuous improvements. This goes back to a little bit of the former, like especially when it comes to cost improvements and process improvements. So resource and process. I think anytime get a pool of ideas, so this is something we've started doing in our team. Get a pool of ideas, and you'll quickly see the ideas break down into, okay, these are things easy to do, easy to roll back if they don't work. Then you'll have a second pool, which is slightly harder to do, but can happen within some time. So you can try a few of them, and even if they fail, it's not end of the world. And then you have a few which are big payoffs, but also big investment, and there you want to be more judicious. So both for process and resource improvements, collect this list. And you'll see once you get a few landed, the overall organization will lean in a lot more. Because they're okay, stuff is happening. A good example is for resources, people often start by let's re-architect the system. But then you can figure out that, we have this memory, our cache is not ideal. So we can make small tweaks and improve our memory need by 10%. Get that done. And if 10%, if it's over aggressive, you can easily roll that back. Those are things you can do easily, but people often are oh, we have to redesign the whole system. And that conversation becomes the dominating one. So don't shy away from a steady mix of small, medium, and big project ideas.
We as engineers, I'm smiling because we as engineers love nuclear rewrites. Just scratch everything and start from scratch. Everybody loves to start from scratch, but as you said, incremental improvements into the system and fine tuning is a much harder thing to do, especially in the systems that run live.
I used to joke that we are in an industry where a standard pattern of career growth is you rewrite a system, that's one promotion. Then you realize the new system has lots of flaws. You fix those. That's your next promotion. And while fixing those flaws, you realize there's a better system you can write. And then you rewrite it again. That's your third promotion.
Well, let's hope that this is not a far-fetching career advice. So let me actually ask you the last question from you before we open it to Q&A. And it's tied and related. Let's say we have a lot of new managers or people who are just stepping into their first management position. What advice would you have for first-time managers and who have small teams of 2 to 3 people, and how to empower their teams to be more efficient?
Yeah, as I said, if you approach it with that mindset that your teams are a phenomenal resource and we never think about measuring their success and optimizing their success as much. Like a common advice I tell a lot of first time managers that who are often like engineers who then turn into managers that imagine you're a very, very good engineer. You can improve yourself, but even if you try very hard, you'll probably improve your personal productivity by like 100%. If you're already very good, it's unlikely that you'll be more than 100% more productive. On the other hand, if you have a team of 5 people and you can make each one of those people 25% more efficient at what they do and what they do as a team, that adds up to more than 100%. So keep that power in mind, that you have the ability to influence and bring about tremendous amount of efficiency and impact. So ask yourself questions like, is this team functioning right? What are the parameters I can change? Maybe I can, like, the parameters could be as simple as just changing seat arrangements. Well, now we're in a hybrid world, but I have seen like tremendous throughput improve by just like pairing 2 people who can brainstorm off each other to entire system redesign improvements, etc. So don't underestimate the kind of power you can have as leaders in bringing about tremendous change, efficiency, productivity gains. So push for it.
That's very inspirational. Thanks, Shanik. Let's switch then to our Q&A board. We have lots of questions from the audience. So let me start with the first question on how do you incorporate security into engineering process and efficiency?
I think there are a few things which should be seen as highly non-negotiable. And different companies can choose a small subset of these. Security almost always ends up being one such thing. So it's important to not make security feel like an afterthought. So it's important to establish very key like deliverables right up front. An example could be, let's say, your vulnerability management and mitigation. So you can establish a certain number of a certain SLA that at any given time, if we have n vulns, like all my priority 0 vulns will be addressed within 2 weeks. 70% of my P1s will be addressed within a month. Again, each team can establish those deliverables early and don't make them an afterthought. So, and like anytime you regress from that, like that should become your key priority.
Thanks, Shani. We have a next interesting question about something that we didn't touch upon yet on the efficiency in communication. So the question is, our engineers are not aware about what projects we're doing as a product stream. What is the best practice for information sharing between teams working on X cross projects and about team internal development?
Great question. And I think it's a very real thing that if you talk to a vast majority of engineers, they know what they are doing. They often don't see how that fits into the bigger vision. This is, again, something for not just managers and leaders, but everyone. It's important to tie the end-to-end picture, take your vision statement, your mission statement, and set up a process where every person can see how they fit into that. Because once that happens, their gratification increases, so their retention benefits, etc. But also you'll see people will come up with a lot more ideas if they know what's the bigger picture. As a concrete example, not by no means saying that was ideal. Many years back, I used to do analytics. And we used to say that our team's goal was 3 A's. Accumulate data, analyze data, and take actions based on data. And we would then go back to the team and say, okay, each one of you, ask yourself, do you fit into any of these A's? Because if you don't, you should reach out to your manager and say, why am I doing what I'm doing? So every person, like, again, not saying that's the perfect example, but a simple module, a simple framework where everyone is like, okay, I am improving data ingestion pipeline, so I'm on the accumulate side of things. We would then also occasionally like oversee all the work together and see what percentage of people are doing one of these others. So it's important as leaders to tie that up, because then people can say, hey, I have other ideas about like how I can improve this bigger piece, etc.
I love this. The taglines go such a long way in terms of communicating a message that can be reiterated and reminding everybody about what's the mission of what a specific mission for the team or for an initiative. So
Yeah, it has to be simple. It has to be inspiring. It has to be something like a litmus test. We often say someone new joining your team, if they were to tell their friend like what your overall like strategy is, like again public strategy, like can they describe it very quickly? Like if the new people can't, like if your senior most leaders have to come and give a 1 hour presentation to like explain what you're doing and why that's meaningful, you've lost it.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is also a very interesting one. If your engineers have identified a real pain point in the code base, but it's an expensive change that would take a lot of effort to address, how to approach that? How do you get buy-in from product and others?
Again, very, very good question, very common question. I've spoken to, again, many engineering leaders where the common thing is like, there are investments I want to make. How do I convince product? Or like sometimes your finance partner, sometimes go to market. I have been a big believer in some kind of investment framework. The most common, simplest one is imagine any work we are doing falls in 3 categories. There is immediate product deliverable work, there's KTLO, keeping the lights on, and there's investment into the future. And I think it's very important to have active conversations on like, if you have 100 people engineering team, how are you split between this investment mix? And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but having this conversation really helps. So taking the example of product, I found it super helpful to say, let's say 70% of people are focused on product deliverables for now. 15% are doing keeping the lights on, and 15% are investment in the future. Product development can then know that if you have 100 people, 70, they can directly influence the prioritization. And as engineering teams, you should take their opinion, the go-to-market team's opinion, the product team's opinion seriously on that. So even if you feel a feature is going to be the best feature and they disagree, they win that battle because that's the purpose of the investment framework, that go-to-market and product can influence that part. On the other hand, if you feel that I need a system rewrite, and you are funding that from your 15% or 10% or 20%, whatever the number is, future budget, even if product wonders, like, do we have to do a big, like, they trust you. So by having this investment framework, you can kind of draw lines around both how much to invest and like who is the dominant voice in that conversation.
I think that it also ties into what we've talked about earlier, that it's easier to do the nuclear rewrite. But the 10%, 15% that you can carve out consistently go a really long way. So even if 10% doesn't sound very like a lot, if you consistently can get 10% out of every sprint to go towards the improvement, it can go a really, really long way. And it's not a big ask in the grand scheme of things. So,
and on that particular one for big rewrites, especially with product, if you tell them I'm going to spend 2 years to completely rewrite the system, it's a hard sell. Like even like people will doubt you. If you say, I'm going to break this 2-year project into 7 milestones, and you'll start seeing product improvements after each one of them. By the time you deliver your second or third, you'll actually often see them turning into your biggest advocates because they start seeing benefits. So imagine you're doing a full system rewrite, but you start off by improving your front-end framework, and you can start, like, your latency goes down, so your UI becomes a little more interactive. That's a product implication and impact. Like, you delivered. I see the benefit of this new framework. So they'll start backing you a lot more. So make it easier for them to commit to by smaller milestones and tie it back to actual improvements they see on the product or go-to-market side.
Yeah, thanks, Shanik. Love the advice. Staying on the trend of dealing with pushback, our next question is, how do you handle pushback when trying to implement these types of metrics? I guess the efficiency metrics, like lines of code pushed, for example, or time to deploy, as you mentioned previously.
Yeah, so I think 3 key kinds of pushback comes. I mentioned 2 of them. One is people strive for perfection, and there is no perfection. Like if there was an established set of metrics that we all agreed on, like this conversation wouldn't be happening. So as leaders, again, make sure you are not giving up progress for some elusive perfection. So that's one. The second is, again, I mentioned the dominant voices. Like you often, like your senior most architects, like they're like, oh, like don't worry. The only reason things seem slower is because the new folks don't know how to do things right. So make sure you're getting the right feedback and not a few. And it doesn't have to be the senior most people. Like make sure you're getting the right feedback. The third one, which I didn't touch on, which is psychological safety. People often feel whatever metric will instantly like judge them incorrectly. So it's like the moment you start, like let's say you were to say number of code commits, someone's like, hey, I've been working on like architecting the system, I haven't generated like or like your data science team is like, hey, we run a lot of analysis and experiments, we might not be producing code. So to like both to be cognizant of that and reassure people that these are used in aggregate or for some kind of directional guidance, but not to judge individuals, and that you'll always look at things with a finer lens to put the nuance aspect in. So those are the three initial pushbacks. So
thanks for calling out psychological safety. As you said, Janik, I think the moment somebody says metrics, people just think about their individual performance and how that's going to impact their career. So I absolutely loved your advice about you reminding people that it can be used in aggregate. Next question we have is how do you enable effective decision making while ensuring risks are properly understood and information flows properly to you as needed without slowing teams down? So I guess, what do you do when everything is happening everywhere all at once?
Yeah, so this is a topic very, very close to my heart. Like I feel like one of the things that start breaking down really early in teams is decision making. The moment, like, in the very early days, it's just a few people. Decision making is everyone can sit and talk it out. It's easy. But as teams grow, as products grow, like we spend so much time in like more than decision making and indecision making, where people are just talking. The most common outcome of meetings is like, let's have another meeting. So I feel very passionately about this. Over the years, we've if people are interested, we've tried entire frameworks, and we won't have time to go through all of them. Some key things to keep in mind. I think it's very important to unblock everyone in the team. And I think it's important. So set up a process where if any person is blocked, they have an escalation path to unblock themselves. Obviously, the more they are empowered to unblock themselves, that's best. If not, they should be able to reach out to their managers or some kind of counsel. If that counsel or manager is delaying up to us after a certain point, there should be an escalation till eventually like someone unblocks them. The worst thing we can do is hire great people and have them feel blocked on others. So keep that in mind. The second is make it very, so I'll give a summary of the decision-making frameworks I've seen work very well. 4 things that are key in it. Very clearly call out what the decision comprises of and what are not parts of the decision, because often like people bring in more to the table, and like you just wanted to know, like, in this process, do I need this person's approval? And before you know it, you're like redesigning your entire like program management chain. So be very clear on what is the decision about. The second is the timeline. Like, is there a hard timeline? So sometimes like something might need a decision in a week. Be very explicit about it. The third is be very clear who all are the decision makers, because one of the biggest reasons why decision making fails is it's so much fun that like a group of people just come and love discussing. It's so easy to say, told you so, this won't work, like that. So make it very, very clear who the decision makers are, what kind of data they need, and establish a process. So if the decision maker is like, imagine if it's one decision maker, it's clear. If it's like multiple decision makers, like eventually if there's a standstill, like how will you break it? So the process must support that. So the key decision makers and the process. And the fourth piece is communicating a decision and being very explicit about under what circumstances you will revisit them. Because a common failure mode is you make a decision and then in a week you're like, I was thinking about that. I don't feel very good about it. Or like, can we just revisit that? Like, is it new data? What kind of new data? Is it like customer validation? Be very clear. Or like sometimes just time boxing that, hey, we think this thing will work. We'll give it 6 months. And 6 months, if this doesn't happen, we revisit that. So being very explicit. Again, there's lots of details. We've had like very nice templates that facilitate better decision making. But these are 4 pieces that are super helpful.
And thanks for bringing up the communicating decision. And I think a lot of the times people will make a decision, but then forget to notify everybody else. So making sure that everybody's also aware that decision was made is also extremely important. Next question is a tough one. We started the discussion that efficiency is so much more important due to layoffs. So the question is, where do you cut on your tech roadmap after a layoff?
So it will be it'll be a combined conversation. Product, others have to be part of it. There is no single answer. Like sometimes you might actually cut back on, more often than not, in that investment framework that I mentioned. During times of layoff, the future investment gets cut. Like it's hard to cut on keeping the lights on because then your existing thing degrades further. More often than not, like the reason you're probably doing layoffs is you feel for what you're delivering, you're using more resources. So by delivering even less now, it worsens the situation. So you end up optimizing more on tactical short-term roadmap and the things you sacrifice are long-term things. There's no hard and fast rule. One suggestion I would give is when you cut, it's better to cut complete things than to peanut butter. A common pattern I've often seen is like, if 100 people were doing 10 projects, you've laid off 10 people. Now you're doing 10 projects, but now you have 9 people doing each one of them. What you end up doing is doing injustice. If 10 was the right, now you can debate that whether 10 was the right number of people for each of those projects. If that's not the case, then no. But if it was, then it's better to kill something completely than peanut butter your cuts throughout.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the advice. Next question about how to drive efficiencies around people in the same position. So the example is team leads with ideas but no consensus who can lead the initiative and if we should even do it. How would you approach it?
In general, try to empower your teams as much as possible. Something we've tried in some of our pockets recently is that whatever is your definition of a team at some level, like it doesn't have to be on a manager, it could be based on a project, it could be based on a milestone, it could be like anything. What percentage of the team's decisions are contained within that team? If that number is less than 70, you should revisit whether you have your teams organized the right way. Like basically, if you always need like 10 teams to show up and they all have to do things for each other for anything to happen, again, going back to the example of as leaders thinking about how do you optimize teams, that would be a failure mode where you have a very dense dependency tree. Now, it's, I think, impractical to think a team will be completely self-sufficient. You probably have a mix of horizontal and vertical teams, etc. But if your team needs to rely on others, like more than 30% of the times for their like you're not setting them up for success.
Yeah, that's a good advice. Shenik, you talked about a tipping point from small to big where things change, but it's hard to notice the difference when you go through scaling yourself. What's a clear indication that you must do things differently?
Again, no hard and fast rule, but something I have personally followed is I have seen every doubling introduces a very new challenge and a very new mode of working. So as a manager, like that, this is not specific to managers. It could be to teams, it could be to projects. But if you're a 10 people team, the way you function will be different when you're a 20 people team. Like at 10, probably everyone knows everyone, everyone trusts everyone, everyone knows the code base. At 20, that's so every doubling introduces both some new challenge and requires some fundamental altering of the way you function. And if you are thinking of doubling while just incrementally changing things, you're probably not doing it right.
Yeah. Last questions that we have. Should you base close processes stack on peak activity? Seems like a risky move right now.
I think it depends on products. Like if it's end user, like on a serving stack, it's hard to not provision for the peak unless there's like clearly traffic you can drop. For for offline processing pipelines, etc., I think you can be more creative because you like batch processes. Something was taking an hour, it might take an hour and 15 minutes. So I think it comes down to whether it's a batch system or an online system that helps. Even in online systems, I think it helps to break down when you look at overall peak. For example, if you break things down, you might see that some part of your product has its peak on weekdays, some has it on weekends, and you can do interesting things around like bringing them together or like co-locating resources in a certain pattern, etc. So look at that. There is no fixed rule, but yes, online systems, unless you can identify traffic to drop, it's hard to not provision for peak. Levers to consider are, is there some kind of degradation that's acceptable at peak for some fraction of users? So for example, you can say, I will still provision for peak, but at peak, my accepted latency can be 10% more. That allows you to still lower your peak resource need without like dropping queries, etc. So look at some of these segments and ask yourself, like, what can you drop? And often the answer will be nothing. What can you degrade and do based on that? And then also definitely provision for some kind of surprise, because surprises will happen, but don't over provision for it. Like a failure mode I've sometimes seen is people will cite that one time in March 5 years back when one customer sent 100x the resources requests. So that's become the go-to. So everything is like 100x provision because like that one incident happened. And a big thing, try to heavily incorporate isolation in your system, so individual customers don't degrade your overall system. So that'll really help you in peak provisioning because you can do a better job thinking about aggregates as opposed to one-off peaks caused by customers.
Shanik, this was the last question from the audience. I want to thank our audience for great questions today and thank them for joining us. And Shanik, thank you so much for our discussion. I personally learned so much and it was such a relevant topic, and I can't wait to go back tomorrow to my teams and try to do more incremental changes.
It was an absolute pleasure. Like, thank you so much. It was a really fun discussion.
It was a great discussion. The next great discussion by Plato, for everyone, if you're wondering, is going to be on 9th of February with Figma CTO. And we're done for today. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Shanik.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone.